In creating a new WinForm GUI project within Visual Studio and Visual Basic, we had several dialogues in setting up that project, one of which is we're providing a project name and a location. And I mentioned there's this checkbox here that says to place the solution and project in the same directory. So I created a project called demo SLN included, SLN being that solution file. And then I created another project called demo-SLN excluded, and I didn't check that box. I left it unchecked. Let's take a look at how that plays into our file structure for the project. By the way, notice one thing here is that in the included we have one folder under projects, but in the excluded one we have the same folder again embedded in that first folder. So we have a double folder name there. Let's take a look at this in Windows Explorer. In Windows Explorer, I have my two folders, my two project folders. One has the SLN included, one has the SLN excluded. And if we look at the difference between the two, here is the included project, and you'll see the solution file there listed with all these other files. And we'll look at what each of these are here in a minute. There's also some folders here inside of our project. So Visual Studio creates a bunch of stuff for us when we first set up a project, including some subfolders. Let's take a look now at the same project, but as the solution excluded. And we see the solution file there, and then there's a subfolder called demo-SLN excluded. So the same folder name as a subfolder, and you see that it includes all those files that were part of the project folder of the included. So it's just a different way of structuring it. Keeping the solution file with all the other files is a recent addition into Visual Studio. I think it makes a nice format in that everything is together. It makes it easier to zip. Regardless, when you go to submit your project to your instructor, you will right-click on the main folder of that project that contains the solution file and zip that folder. So it contains all the files and all the folders. In order to open up your project and review it and run it, I need the entire project, including the solution file. So always look for your root folder for that project, and that's what you're going to zip. Let's take a closer look at what each of these files are and their purpose. So when we create a project, we're getting a whole bunch of files and some folders created for us by Visual Studio. We'll come back to the folders here in a minute, but looking at the file names alphabetized here, we have an application events.vb. That's an XML file that keeps track of things like event triggers. Now really on all these files, we're not going to work with these directly. You should not open them directly other than this solution file. If you create a project and close it and want to come back to it and reopen it, maybe do some more work on it, come to Windows Explorer, find your project, find that solution file, the .sln, and double click on that. That will launch Visual Studio and open up your project inside of it. You can think of the solution file as the book cover of your project. If we're going to read a book, we need to open up the cover. If we're going to work on our project, we need to open up the solution file. By the way, make sure in Windows Explorer that you are viewing the file extensions. There's an option under the View menu at Windows Explorer to turn those extensions on or off, so you'll see the .sln. Then we have a VB project file. Its extension is .vbproj. This is sort of the table of contents or the index of our project. It contains links to all of these files. And then there's a .user one that contains our user settings and options for the project. When we're creating the user interface, we are dragging objects from the toolbox onto our form and changing properties and changing names. And the location and names and properties of all those objects is being recorded in a code file that is the .designer.vb file. In a lot of languages, we have to write code to create our GUI. But here in Visual Basic, as well as in Visual C#, we can use the toolbox to visually create our objects. But in reality, Visual Studio is writing the code for us. And that's that designer.vb file. We also have a resource file, .resx, and that contains things like our strings and our icons and images and music and so forth we might include in our project. If you download a project made from Canvas that I provided or somebody else has provided, and you open it in Visual Studio, you may get this restriction of the resx file having the mark of the web. That's a security setting based on your security options you have turned on. And so you may need to exit Visual Studio, go into Windows Explorer, and look at the properties for the resx file and check the unblock checkbox there and save it. Then reopen your project. Then there's the code that we write. That's those event handlers and the code in between the event handlers and any functions or methods we create. Those are going to be a .vb file. Same with when we get into creating our own classes. Those will also be .vb files. Those are code files in Visual Basic. If we're working in C#, they would be .cs files. Then we have some folders. You can turn hidden folders and files on inside of Windows Explorer. And if you do that, you'll notice there's a folder here called .vs. That's hidden files created by Visual Studio. There's a bin folder that contains the binary files that are used in creating our executable for deployment. We'll look at that in a little more in depth here in a second. The My Project also contains some generated source files for Visual Studio. And the OBJ are the object files, and those are sort of in-between files from our source code to our compiled executable. There's some object files being created. With all of those folders, there's no reason really to go in and look at any of those files other than the bin folder. Let's take a look at the bin folder. Inside the bin folder is a debug folder. Inside that folder, we'll find a reference to the .NET framework we are creating for. In this case, is .NET 8 is the current one. And inside that folder then is our executable. That's our target. That's what we want to create. I can take that executable to the .exe extension and double click on it and run it without Visual Studio. Now there's some DLLs, dynamic link libraries, and a project database file, and some JSON files. Those are used in support of that executable. The main one we're concerned about here is the executable. You can actually run that on any Windows computer as long as they have the .NET framework that we're targeting, .NET 8. And depending on how security is set up for that computer, you may have to bypass some security issues to run it. And so we'll look down the road at how to create an installer that will make that process even simpler. But again, that executable is what you can run on your computer without any problem. Just double click on it and it'll run your application. You don't have to open up Visual Studio to test and run your application. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Programming Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.